Welcome to Somali Nexus, where stories from the Horn of Africa are explored with clarity, depth, and truth. In today's episode, we're diving into one of the most compelling and controversial questions about Somalia. Is the country sitting on a gold mine of natural resources, or is it all just a myth? For years, the global narrative around Somalia has focused on instability and crisis. But beneath that surface lies a lesser-told story, one of immense mineral potential. Geological data points to vast deposits of oil, natural gas, gold, uranium, lithium, and other rare earth minerals. In fact, some experts estimate 30 billion barrels of oil equivalent offshore alone. So why hasn't this potential been realized? What's stopping Somalia from joining the ranks of resource-rich nations? In this episode of Somali Nexus, we'll explore the confirmed mineral discoveries and the science behind them, the rise of artisanal gold mining in regions like Milho, the geopolitical weight of Somalia's uranium and rare earths, and what it will take for this resource-rich nation to transform potential into prosperity. So, myth or gold mine? Stick with us as we unpack the truth behind the headlines and explore the real wealth beneath Somali soil. Welcome to this deep dive. We've got quite a stack of information here, all focused on, well, a really fascinating, and as you'll definitely see, an incredibly complex topic: Somalia's mineral wealth.
That's right. And for this analysis, we're drawing everything from one single, pretty comprehensive source. It's titled Somalia's Mineral Wealth, Myth or the Next Global Gold Mine. And it gives us a really detailed look at what might be under the ground in Somalia, but also the huge, huge hurdles to actually getting it out.
So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We're going to unpack this source for you. We want to pull out the most important facts, the key figures, and crucially, the complexities, so you can get a good, thorough understanding quickly of Somalia's geological
potential and also the history of looking for it. Right? What's actually been found exactly.
The specific resources, and maybe most importantly, the massive challenges that are preventing, widespread responsible development right now. Think of this as your shortcut to understanding what could be a transformative part of Somalia's future, but one that's, currently very fragile. Let's jump in.
Okay, let's unpack it. The core idea, sort of the headline here, is that Somalia seems to be sitting on a really rich and varied collection of minerals, and for the most part, they're largely untouched. That holds, immense promise.
And we're not talking small change here, are we? The analysis points to significant oil and gas potential, especially offshore. But it's not just that, right? There's, uranium, gold, even things called world-class industrial minerals like Sepiolite.
Yeah, and that's where you get some really eye-catching numbers thrown around early on. For oil and gas estimates for recoverable oil potential, they vary wildly. You hear tens of billions of barrels from some industry folks, right up to potentially over 110 billion barrels from one company estimate.
Wow, 110 billion. That's huge.
It is. And for uranium, historical data suggested deposits may be as large as 150,000 tons of. And that Sepiolite, which is also known as Milxo, there are estimates around 100 million tons just in one area. So, yeah, numbers like that paint a picture of just incredible potential wealth.
It sounds almost too good to be true. And the analysis brings in the counterpoint pretty quickly, doesn't it?
Immediately. This huge potential, these massive numbers, they're basically matched by, decades of instability, conflict, infrastructure that's been badly damaged.
Right, so a land of riches struggling with some really deep-seated problems.
That's the story, basically. Geology versus human history and institutional weakness.
Okay, so let's dig in. Quite literally, what's the geological foundation for all this? Why Somalia?
Well, Somalia's mineral potential is really tied to its very ancient geological history. We're talking over 700 million years back. You can think of it broadly in two main geological settings.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's the really old stuff, the ancient crystalline basement. This is Precambrian rock, igneous and metamorphic stuff. Very hard. You find it sticking out in northern Somaliland mainly, and also down south in the Bur region.
What kind of rocks are we talking about?
Things like gneiss, migmatite, iron-rich quartzite, marble. The analysis mentions these in this ancient basement. That's where geologists expect to find potential for metals. Gold-based metals like copper and lead, iron ore, and also some types of uranium deposits.
Okay, so the old hard rocks hold the metals. What's the second type?
The second type is the younger stuff layered on top, the sedimentary basins. These are thick piles of sedimentary rocks laid down over millions of years covering that old basement. And these are absolutely crucial for oil and gas.
Where are the main ones?
The analysis highlights two major, the Luke Mandara Basin in the southwest and the Somali coastal basin that runs along the Indian Ocean coast.
And how thick can these layers get?
Pretty thick, up to 5 kilometers in places. And within those layers, you find rocks from specific periods like the late Triassic to early Jurassic that are seen as ideal source rocks where oil and gas could actually form, and reservoir rocks where it could get trapped.
And plate tectonics played a role. The continents moving?
Oh, absolutely fundamental. The breakup of the old supercontinent Gondwana, the opening of the Indian Ocean, the way the Somali plate rifted away from the Arabian plate. All these huge geological events created the structure, the folds and faults that are favorable for trapping oil and gas. It also shaped basins like the Guban Basin up in Somaliland.
So the geology really dictates what you
Find and where, exactly. And it also dictates how you look for it. You use seismic surveys to map out those thick, sedimentary layers when you're hunting for hydrocarbons offshore or onshore. But for metals in those basement areas, you're using different techniques like prospecting, drilling, looking at the rock outcrops.
Makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears. What's the history of actually looking for these minerals in Somalia? Has it been a steady effort?
Not at all. The analysis describes exploration as irregular. Basically, it ebbs and flows entirely based on the political situation. You get short periods of relative stability where some work happens, but then long stretches where instability just stops everything cold.
So a pretty bumpy road.
Very bumpy. There were efforts back in colonial times, and then in the early post-independence years leading up to the Civil War in 1991. A lot of that early work focused on those basement areas. We just talked about the Bur Massif and the northern areas.
Who was involved back then?
You had government surveys, the Ministry of Minerals and Petroleum, often with help from international groups like the UNDP or partner countries. Somali National University researchers were involved, even Soviet geologists at one point. They found lots of mineral occurrences, but very few ever became actual working mines. The analysis points out that by 1988, minerals were contributing something like 0.3% to Somalia's GDP. Tiny. Interestingly, there's a regional difference noted. The former British Somaliland, which is now Somaliland, seems to have been better researched historically. There's even mention of a key report from way back in 1924 by a British geologist, Robert Alexander Farquharson, documenting gold, beryl, garnet, galena, mica, gypsum up there.
Wow, 1924. So some of this baseline flying knowledge is almost a century old.
Yes, and that's a really critical point that comes up later. But before the war, the 1980s actually saw a peak in activity. That's when major international oil companies got seriously involved. Big names, ConocoPhillips, Shell Amoco, Eni, Total, Texaco, they were all exploring for oil and gas.
The majors were definitely interested.
They were. And uranium exploration was also pretty active. From the 60s through the 80s, UNDP surveys identified radioactive anomalies, which led to ground surveys by foreign companies like Silmirum, White Star Mining, and some German firms in the Bor and Mudug regions.
And then came 1991, and that just brought everything to a screeching halt.
The Civil War forced a total suspension of all exploration and potential development. The central government collapsed. There was no clear authority. Massive uncertainty about rights and contracts. The foreign investment just evaporated. It's only very, very recently that some tentative interest has started to bubble up again, and usually just in specific, relatively more stable regions, or for specific resources.
And you mentioned relying on old data.
Yes, the analysis really emphasizes this for many of the non-petroleum minerals. What we know about potential deposits still relies heavily on these old, often incomplete historical surveys from decades ago. It just highlights this massive need for modern systematic geological mapping and assess using today's technology to get a real picture.
It sounds like they have fragments of an old treasure map, but they need a modern GPS survey to see what's actually there.
Now, that's a great analogy. By modern exploration standards, much of the country, especially for solid minerals, remains fundamentally underexplored.
Okay, let's zoom in on the big one then. Oil and gas, black gold. The analysis suggests really considerable promise here.
It definitely does. The underlying geology points strongly towards extensive hydrocarbon systems that just haven't really been tested commercially. The offshore areas in particular are consistently highlighted as having very high potential.
And there's been recent work, seismic surveys.
Yes, quite a bit. Recently, modern seismic surveys have been shot, and they've apparently identified at least 69 undrilled prospects and leads. The analysis mentions that some of the geological structures they're seeing look similar to those in Mozambique's Rovuma Basin, which is hugely prolific. Some suggestions are they could even be larger.
Wow. Comparing it to Rovuma, that's a significant statement.
It really is. And onshore, the interest focuses on those big sedimentary basins, the Lukmandera and the Somali coastal basins, with those thick layers of potential source and reservoir rocks.
Okay, let's tackle those huge estimates again. Tens of billions, maybe up to 110 billion barrels. What do those numbers actually represent?
Right? This is where precision is key. The analysis lays out these different figures. 30 billion barrels, sometimes cited for the whole country, tens of billions, often quoted by industry sources. And yes, that very high-end 110 billion barrel figure linked to one company's assessment. But the absolutely critical point is these are potential or estimated resources. They are not proven reserves.
What's the difference?
Proven reserves are what you confirm through actual drilling testing wells. These large numbers are based on interpreting the geology, the seismic data, their educated projections. They definitely create excitement and attract interest, no doubt about it. But they remain speculative until you drill wells and find out for sure. The analysis notes, for instance, that Somaliland's offshore blocks alone are estimated to hold over 7 billion barrels of prospective resources. So yes, the potential seems significant, but these numbers are models, not guarantees. Getting transparent data shared from the ongoing surveys is really vital to get a clearer picture.
Okay, so the sector is buzzing, as the analysis puts it, but it's all still exploration. No pumps running yet.
Exactly. Zero commercial oil or gas production in Somalia currently. It is purely in the exploration phase, but there is activity. Turkish Petroleum Corporation, TPAO, is a major player right now. They signed a big agreement for onshore blocks in April 2025, and that built on earlier deals. Yes, it follows broader strategic agreements between Turkey and Somalia signed in early 2024. And TPAO also reportedly got exclusive rights for 3 offshore blocks in July 2024.
And the analysis mentioned Turkish ships and naval escorts. That stood out.
It did. It's a very notable detail. Turkey sent its seismic survey vessel, the Reis, to conduct a major 3D survey off the coast that ran for about 7 months from late 2024 into early 2025. And yes, the analysis reports it was escorted by Turkish naval frigates.
That definitely signals high-level strategic interest, doesn't it? Beyond just commercial exploration?
It strongly suggests it. It underscores the geopolitical weight Turkey is putting behind this. And apparently early data coming back from that survey is reportedly suggesting significant reserves could be there.
Interesting. Who else is active?
Coastline Exploration Ltd is another key company. They took over assets from a previous player, Soma Oil and Gas. They hold production sharing agreements, PSAs for deep water blocks, and have access to a lot of seismic data. The analysis contrasts their reported deal terms, things like a 10.12.5% royalty rate for Somalia, plus production bonuses, suggesting these might look more aligned with typical international industry standards compared to what's been reported about the TPAO deal.
What about the original players, Shell and ExxonMobil, who were there before the war? Are they still in the picture?
They still hold the rights to licenses that were suspended back in 1991. The government has been pushing them to reactivate, and the analysis says a joint venture between Shell and ExxonMobil has agreed on an initial plan for potential offshore work. There's also interest mentioned from companies based in the US, Britain, Norway, Qatar, and Italy.
So still no production. But is there a chance of seeing oil flow relatively soon if some of this exploration hits big?
The analysis does mention that possibility. It suggests that if current efforts, maybe especially TPAO's recent big survey, lead to quick confirmation of commercial reserves, then early production could potentially hypothetically start maybe late 2025 or early 2026. That would be a very fast track, likely driven by the urgent need for.
Revenue and the potential impact if oil does come online.
Oh, it could be utterly transformative for the economy, generating jobs, bringing in substantial government revenue, potentially reversing decades of economic decline. And Somalia's location on the Indian Ocean is actually pretty strategic for exporting oil and gas.
Has the government put the legal pieces in place for this?
Yes. On the petroleum side, the federal government has actually made quite significant progress. They passed a modern petroleum law in 2020. They established a petroleum revenue sharing agreement, which is crucial for figuring out how money gets divided between the federal government and the member states. And they set up the Somali Petroleum Authority, the SPA, to regulate the upstream sector. There's even a downstream regulatory framework coming into effect in June 2025.
That all sounds positive, like building the right foundations.
On paper, yes, it looks like progress towards transparency and proper management. However, the analysis then introduces a major controversy, and it specifically centers on some of the recent production sharing agreements with the TPAO deal, drawing particular criticism.
Okay, what are the reported concerns about that TPAO deal?
Well, critics reportedly argue that the terms might not align with international best practices or potentially even with Somalia's own 2020 petroleum law. So, specific concerns mentioned include a potential lack of public bidding for the blocks awarded and questions about the minimum work commitments TPAO is obligated to perform, and the financial terms that seems to be a major point of contention. The reported fiscal terms, particularly the mechanism for cost recovery, how the company gets its investment back before profits are shared, are seen as heavily favoring the operator. There are reports suggesting the company could recover up to 90% of the revenue from production to cover its costs before Somalia gets its share of the profit.
Oil 90% cost recovery. What does that leave for Somalia?
Potentially very little from the overall pot, especially in the early years. Some critics cited in the analysis suggest Somalia's ultimate share could be as low as 5% of the total value under certain scenarios. This really highlights that classic tension for resource-rich developing countries. How do you attract urgently needed investment without giving away too much? How do you balance that against good governance, transparency, and ensuring fair long-term benefits for the nation?
And raises the risk of the resource curse, right?
Exactly. The risk that this potential wealth, if not managed incredibly carefully and transparently from the very start, could end up fueling corruption or conflict rather than sustainable development. The whole situation, including the geopolitical aspect highlighted by the naval escort, points to a really high-stakes environment where careful management is paramount.
Okay, let's shift from oil and gas. What about Somalia's metallic minerals? Gold often gets mentioned.
Gold is definitely described as a gleaming prospect in the analysis. It's mostly found in those ancient basement rock areas we talked about earlier. It occurs in two main ways: as lode gold, found in veins within the hard rock, and as placer gold, which is gold that's eroded out and washed into riverbeds and sediments.
Where are the main gold areas?
Several regions are mentioned. Up north in Somaliland, in areas within Awdal, Sanag, Maroodije, Arabsio, and Abdul Qadir regions in Puntland, the Golis Mountains near Milho, so are noted. And there's also mention of placer gold occurrences around Elbur in central Somalia.
Do we have any real idea how much gold is actually there? Are there solid estimates?
This is a really critical point the analysis makes. There's a significant lack of modern circumstances, systematic measurement of gold resources. You hear these broad statements about immeasurable wealth, but when you look for verified figures based on proper exploration, they're largely absent. Historical reports mention occurrences or traces, but not defined economically viable reserves calculated using modern methods. Somaliland is often described as having high potential, but it remains significantly underexplored. So the honest answer is the true extent of economically recoverable gold is still largely unknown.
How is gold being mined right now then?
Overwhelmingly, it's artisanal and small-scale mining people using very basic tools and methods. The analysis is clear. There are no documented large-scale commercial gold mining operations currently active. The barriers are just too high. Security risks, lack of infrastructure, the weak regulatory environment. There is some activity noted, though. In Puntland, artisanal gold is reportedly processed into semi-refined door bars locally and then exported mostly to the UAE.
And this artisanal focus leads to problems with trade, doesn't it? Illicit flows?
Yes, it's a massive issue. The analysis highlights significant reported gold exports, 315 million US dollars worth in 2023 alone. That made gold Somalia's second largest export commodity. And almost all of it reportedly went to the UAE.
315 million for mostly artisanal mining?
Exactly. That huge figure points directly to a sector that's operating largely outside formal channels. And the consequences are severe.
What kind of consequences?
Well, for the Somali state, it means lost revenue. There are problems with undervaluing the gold when it's exported, widespread smuggling. The analysis even mentions gold from Ethiopia being smuggled through Somaliland to the UAE, and basically a complete lack of effective taxation. The state captures very little of the value, but even worse, the analysis explicitly links this informal gold sector to conflict financing. It highlights the involvement of non-state armed groups, specifically naming ISIS affiliates in Puntland's Bari region as engaging in illegal gold mining to fund their operations.
So the gold is directly fueling the conflict?
Directly. It deprives the state and communities of revenue while actively empowering militant groups and worsening insecurity. The analysis notes that the gemstone trade faces similar problems. Tackling this informal, often illicit trade and breaking its link to conflict financing is absolutely critical if Somalia wants to benefit from its gold resources.
That's a stark connection. Let's move to another resource often mentioned, uranium. Also complex, I imagine.
Extremely complex. Somalia definitely has significant uranium occurrences. They're found in a couple of different geological settings in sedimentary rocks, particularly as calcrete deposits. In the Mudug region, places like Galinsur, Elbur, Wabo, Mirig are mentioned and also hosted within those ancient basement rocks, like the carnotite found at Aliao Gael and the Bur Massif. Those airborne radioactive surveys back in the 60s and 70s were key in first identifying these areas.
And what about the size? There's some very large historical estimates floating around, aren't there?
There are. The analysis cites the most commonly repeated figure, which comes from a 1985 IAEA report, suggesting potential resources around 150,000 tons of U308. That's uranium oxide, the standard form it's measured in. But it also mentions older, perhaps more detailed IAE estimates from 1978, identifying about 7,600 tons of actual uranium metal as identified resources, and a 1983 review giving a speculative range from 0 up to 150,000 tons. 2. Specific deposit areas like Aliao Gale and the combined Mudug prospects have historical estimates usually in the low thousands of tons of uranium metal, each so substantial.
But what about that claim you sometimes hear about Somalia holding a third of the world's known reserves?
The analysis tackles that head-on. It states that claim is likely an exaggeration based on unverified speculation, not hard data. While 150,000 tons, if accurate, would be a very significant national resource, it's nowhere near a third of current known global reserves. The analysis stresses the importance of using realistic, technically grounded estimates for policymaking, not just repeating old, possibly inflated, speculative numbers.
What's the exploration history for uranium?
It was quite active for a period, mainly from the 1960s through the 1980s. After the UNDP surveys flagged anomalies, various international groups got involved. Nuclear Somalia, an AGP subsidiary, worked at Aliao Gaele but found it low-grade and difficult. White Star Mining and German companies explored Mudug, defining anomalies, but apparently not economic deposits assets at the time. A state company, SOAMICO, also surveyed Mudug and did some pre-feasibility work. But like everything else, it all stopped abruptly with the Civil War in 1991.
Has interest picked up again recently?
Yes, the federal government has shown renewed interest. The analysis notes a significant development. In September 2024, a partnership was announced with a company called Almond Energy. It's described as a Somali-owned logistics company with reportedly no prior mining experience. They've been designated as the lead partner for renewed uranium exploration.
A logistics company leading uranium exploration?
Yes, and Almond is also reportedly involved in drafting new uranium regulations. For the country around the same time, Somalia joined the International Atomic Energy Agency in September 2024, a move apparently facilitated by Almond and some Kenyan advisors.
It sounds unconventional.
It does raise eyebrows, and the analysis flags it as a point of concern. It leads directly into the massive challenges facing any potential uranium development. Despite the geological potential and past exploration, Somalia has absolutely zero history of commercial uranium production.
And why is that?
The analysis is blunt. It boils down to the enduring impact of instability, insecurity, and severe governance deficits. The challenges are really multi-layered and profound. First, security. This is huge. Large parts of the main uranium region, Mudug, are under the influence or direct control of al-Shabaab. UN monitors confirmed in 2023 that al-Shabaab had actually seized control of former uranium exploration sites. This raises terrifying national security and international non-proliferation concerns. Operating there is incredibly risky.
Non-proliferation is a major international concern with uranium.
Absolutely. Then there's political instability. The federal government's actual control outside Mogadishu is often weak. Federal member states like Galmudug, where Mudug is located, have a lot of autonomy. Local authorities might resist projects pushed by the FGS if they don't see clear benefits or weren't consulted properly. Third, governance and corruption. Somalia ranks near the very bottom of Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. That lack of trust, the absence of a reliable judiciary, and concerns about non-transparent deals like the Almond Energy Partnership raising alarms just scares off legitimate, responsible international investors.
Okay, so security, politics, governance, outdated legal framework.
The current mining law dates back to 1984. It's totally inadequate for governing modern uranium mining, especially regarding environmental protection, waste management, and community rights. And the fact that a private company with vested interests is reportedly drafting new sector-specific regulations raises serious transparency questions. And finally, just the basics. Lack of infrastructure and capacity, roads, power, water, it's all lacking in these remote areas. Plus, there's a severe shortage of Somalis with the technical and regulatory skills needed to manage such a complex sector.
It sounds like the risks might heavily outweigh the rewards right now.
That's essentially the conclusion in the analysis regarding uranium. This recent push, especially involving entities without mining track records and amid such deep insecurity and weak governance, raises serious red flags. Without fundamental sweeping improvements in security and governance, commercial uranium development seems highly improbable and potentially very dangerous in the foreseeable future.
A very sobering assessment. Okay, let's turn to iron ore. Is that a major resource for Somalia?
Somalia does have known iron ore deposits. Historically, some were considered maybe too low-grade or not large enough for big modern mines. But the analysis also mentions talk of large, untapped reserves. Key locations include coastal black sands and Somaliland deposits in the Bor region's Diansour complex and areas in central Somalia.
Are there specific estimates for any of these?
Yes. The analysis gives a couple of examples. The Burgalen deposit is estimated at nearly 400 million tons, but grading only around 38.7% iron, which is relatively low. Dahimir is smaller, 30 million tons, same sort of grade. The Somaliland coastal black sands are interesting because they apparently have high iron and titanium content, over 70% combined, which could be valuable if the volume is.
Therefore, is any iron ore being mined commercially?
No, the analysis says these deposits are largely untouched by commercial operations. The usual suspects are blamed. Poor infrastructure, ongoing conflict, and maybe the perception of low grades. For some deposits, developing them would need massive investment in railways, ports, power. It's a huge undertaking. Those coastal sands might offer an easier route for smaller-scale niche market production. Maybe.
Okay, how about tin? You mentioned it had some history of production.
It does. Deposits of cassiterite, the main tin ore, are found mainly up in Somaliland's eastern Sanag region. Places like Asili Dalan Dagakul, Arigabo area, and also the Dalan and Magiohan area, known for tin tantalum. Historically, these were seen as maybe small or low quality for large-scale mining. But again, large untapped reserves are mentioned.
When was it mined?
There was actual commercial tin mining in the Arigabo area of Somaliland before World War II under the British, and then later in the 1970s, a Bulgarian company called Techno Export worked the tin tantalum deposits at Dalan and Magiohan.
So, a definite history. But quiet now?
Pretty much. The analysis describes tin as largely untapped. Currently, any production is likely just very small-scale artisanal stuff. There's no significant commercial interest reported right now. But importantly, it seems the lack of activity is due to instability and lack of investment, not because the tin is gone. So, potential exists if conditions change?
What about tantalum and niobium? These are often found together with tin, and they're high-value metals used in electronics, right, Colton?
Exactly. They occur as the mineral columbite tantalite, often in association with rare metal granites, pegmatites, and also in placer deposits derived from these rocks. Locations mentioned include pegmatites between Berbera and Bon and Somaliland, and generally within the Proterozoic basement rocks. The analysis even specifically notes Simpsonite, which is a high-grade tantalum mineral being found on beaches east of Berbera, suggesting primary sources nearby.
Are there estimates of how much might be there?
The analysis doesn't give specific resource or reserve numbers for tantalum and niobium. However, it confirms their presence through historical production and export data. A U.S. Geological Survey report from 2009 actually included Somalia among countries with artisanal tantalum output.
So it's being extracted now.
Yes, in small amounts, artisanally. But here's a striking point from the analysis. Back in 2013, ores containing niobium, tantalum, and vanadium apparently accounted for something like 97% of the total value of Somalia's reported mineral exports.
Wow, 97% of the value from small artisanal production?
Yes, it highlights just how incredibly valuable these minerals are per unit of weight, and that immediately raises concerns.
The same concerns as with gold? Illicit trade.
Precisely. The analysis points to issues of traceability, ethical sourcing, especially given the global association of coltan with conflict minerals, and whether Somalia is actually capturing fair value for these high-value exports. Their low volume but high value makes them extremely vulnerable to being smuggled out through informal channels, bypassing any official oversight or revenue collection.
Okay, moving down the list, what about copper?
Copper occurrences are known, but it's currently unexploited commercially. The analysis mentions examples like lead, zinc, copper deposits in limestone in Somaliland's Collegiate region, some chromium copper, anomalies found in gabbro rocks, and copper-bearing quartzites in the Bowl area. Polymetallic potential, meaning deposits with multiple metals, is also mentioned.
Any idea of the scale?
No specific reserve estimates are given. They're generally described as unexploited or relatively small known deposits. No significant commercial extraction is reported. If any happens, it's likely artisanal. The potential for copper seems to remain mostly at the early exploration stage.
And bauxite, the ore for aluminum.
Bauxite deposits are reported to exist, but the analysis is pretty vague on the details. Specific locations or resource estimates are scarce. It even notes that some mineral inventories compiled for Somaliland don't mention it. So it's described as largely unexploited with no current commercial extraction or advanced exploration happening. Seems like a lower priority compared to other minerals based on the available information.
Right. So we've covered the traditional metals and hydrocarbons. What about the minerals everyone's talking about now? The ones needed for green tech batteries? Lithium, rare earths.
Yes, this is definitely an emerging area of interest and potentially very significant. The global demand for these so-called critical minerals is obviously soaring. And Somalia, particularly Somaliland, is starting to be seen as a promising, though still largely unexplored frontier for them.
What indications of potential are there?
Well, lithium gets mentioned as part of that general immeasurable wealth statement. A UN survey back in the day found anomalous traces in Somaliland. More recently, the Somaliland Ministry of Energy and Minerals has confirmed its presence and even reported discovering significant lithium deposits, which are now attracting international attention. The potential seems linked to specific geological formations called LCT pegmatites, that stands for lithium, cesium, tantalum, which are known globally to host these valuable elements. Areas like Gabale and Sahel and Somaliland are mentioned. As for rare earth elements, REEs, the analysis suggests they're believed to exist in huge quantities within Somaliland's ancient basement rocks.
Is anyone actively looking for these now?
Yes, things are starting to happen, although it's still early days and mostly focused on Somaliland. A Saudi company, Kilo Mass, got a major exploration license in June 2024, specifically for lithium and associated base metals near Hargeisa. The analysis calls this a landmark investment.
Saudi interest? Okay, who else?
Taiwanese companies are also showing strong interest. There was a mining cooperation agreement signed between Taiwan and Somaliland back in 2022. And Taiwan's state-owned oil company, CPC Corporation, which is already exploring for oil there, is reportedly considering diversifying into mining these critical minerals too. The Somaliland ministry seems very active in promoting this potential and issuing licenses.
And this clearly has a geopolitical dimension, doesn't it? Diversifying supply chains away from China.
Oh, absolutely. The analysis explicitly links this growing interest in Somaliland's lithium and REs to global strategies trying to secure alternative sources for minerals currently dominated by China, especially in processing. So partnerships developing with entities from the US, Saudi Arabia, Taiwan, they're often viewed through the strategic lens.
Could this give Somaliland some unique leverage?
Potentially, yes. It could attract significant investment, maybe international aid, and give Somaliland a degree of geopolitical importance it hasn't had before. But the analysis cautions it also risks getting tangled up in bigger global rivalries. The key, as always, will be whether Somaliland can put in place transparent regulations, environmental safeguards, and ensure the benefits are shared fairly with local communities. Otherwise, it just becomes a resource play for outside powers.
A familiar risk. Now, what about Sepiolite or Meerschaum? The analysis called that world-class. That sounds significant.
It really is. Somalia possesses genuinely world-class deposits of sepiolite, which is this unique, lightweight, fibrous clay mineral. They're ranked among the largest known globally. The main deposits are in south-central Somalia in the El Bur district. Specific prospects like Indocabio are estimated to hold around 19 million tons alone, including about 3.5 million tons of the high-quality Meerschaum variety. The wider El Bur area could hold estimates around 100 million tons in total. That's globally significant.
Has it been mined historically?
Yes, there's a very long tradition of mining it in El Bur going back centuries. It was used locally to make traditional crafts like stoves, burjiko, incense burners, edin or dabkad, and famously Meerschaum pipes. For a while, it was reportedly Somalia's only consistent mineral export. Currently, extraction is mostly artisanal and small-scale.
But it has industrial uses too, right?
Huge industrial potential because it's porous, absorbent, and fire-resistant. Sepiolite is used in things like cat litter, industrial absorbents, drilling muds for oil and gas filtration, even as a filler in plastics and paints. But this vast industrial potential is largely untapped in Somalia.
A missed opportunity.
The analysis explicitly calls it a major missed opportunity. Realizing this potential would need serious investment in modern mining methods, probably processing plants, quality control systems, and developing access to international industrial markets. As things stand, Somalia isn't benefiting much economically from having this world-class resource.
Okay, how about gemstones, emeralds, rubies?
Yes, Somalia has a variety of gemstones reported. Things like emerald, ruby, sapphire, aquamarine, topaz, tourmaline, garnet. They're mostly found in those pegmatite and metamorphic rocks, particularly in areas like Somaliland, Berber area, northern basement, and the Bur Massif. Small quantities are currently produced.
Is this also mostly artisanal?
Primarily, yes. Artisanal and very small scale. People often just collect them from the surface or dig small pits. There are some exports the analysis mentions about 418,000 US dollars worth in 2023, mainly going to China and the UAE. The ruby trade in particular is noted as growing in both volume and price recently.
So what's the main challenge if they are already exporting some?
The whole sector is described as highly disorganized. There's a real lack of formal market structures, very few licensed dealers, no gemological association or expertise readily available. The value chain is completely fragmented.
Meaning Somalia doesn't capture much value.
Exactly. Value addition activities like cutting and polishing the rough stones are either absent or extremely underdeveloped within Somalia. So rough, uncut stones get exported cheaply, and the vast majority of profit is made later elsewhere when they're processed and sold on the international market.
So potential for growth if it could be formalized?
Significant potential. Formalizing the sector, investing in training for cutting and polishing, establishing quality standards. Maybe creating cooperatives or direct market access could generate much more income, create skilled jobs, and boost legitimate export earnings considerably.
And lastly, what about other industrial minerals? Things used more locally for construction, maybe.
There's a whole range of them, and they seem quite widespread. Gypsum and anhydrate deposits are noted as being particularly huge, especially in Somaliland's Daban Basin near Berbera. Estimates over 180 million tons. Very high purity limestone is found in several places like Berbera, at Surya Malabal, Bardhair, at Bur Anole and Makabli, Bledwain at Jikli, and was used historically for local cement making. There's also kaolin clay, used artisanally now for pottery, but with untapped industrial potential. Phosphate deposits exist, but were historically seen as low quality. Quartz and silica sand are abundant, especially along the coast and in Somaliland. Even coal is mentioned. A large estimate near Berbera needs verification, and guano bird droppings used as fertilizer.
These sounds important for domestic development, right? Building materials?
Absolutely, this is a key point. These widespread industrial minerals offer significant potential for domestic use in construction, manufacturing, maybe agriculture. Currently, they're mostly underutilized or just extracted artisanally. The analysis suggests Somalia might even be importing materials that it could potentially produce itself from these local resources.
So developing these could boost the local economy?
Precisely. It could foster local growth, create jobs, reduce reliance on imports, of course. The coal mention comes with a caveat about environmental challenges and the risk of it becoming a stranded asset in a world moving away from fossil fuels. But for things like gypsum, limestone, clays, they're foundational for construction and industry.
Okay, so we've painted this picture. Enormous potential across a huge range of minerals, from oil and gas to critical metals to basic industrial materials. But now let's really focus on navigating the path ahead. What does the analysis identify as the absolute key influences? And more importantly, the major hurdles blocking the way?
Right. The potential is undeniable, but realizing it means confronting some incredibly deep-seated challenges. The analysis is very clear that the most fundamental, the absolute bedrock issues are security, political stability, and governance.
These come up again and again. How do they specifically block mineral development?
Well, decades of conflict have just left the country incredibly fragile and operating in a perpetually high-risk environment. Militant groups like Al-Shabaab and ISIS affiliates pose a direct physical threat to any potential mining operations personnel and infrastructure. They actively control or contest territory in many resource-rich areas. And crucially, as we discussed with gold and potentially uranium, the analysis states they are directly involved in illegal extraction of resources themselves, using the proceeds to fund their violence. So, resources become part of the conflict dynamic, a massive deterrent. Somalia's consistently dismal ranking on global corruption indices like Transparency International CPI just scares away legitimate long-term international investors. It creates huge uncertainty and the risk that any revenues generated will be siphoned off instead of benefiting the country. Add to that weak state institutions, the lack of a fully functioning independent judiciary, and the fragmented authority between the federal government, FGS, and the federal member states, FMS. It creates a governance landscape that's complex, unpredictable, and extremely high risk. These are truly the primary barriers.
We also talked about the lack of good geological data, especially for the non-petroleum minerals. That's a hurdle too.
A major one. The absence of comprehensive, modern, reliable geological data makes it incredibly difficult for companies to justify the huge upfront investment needed for exploration and development, especially in solid minerals. They're often relying on those patchy, outdated historical surveys. The analysis points out that basic national data collection, like the Restatistics Somalia Agency for Minerals, is practically non-existent.
It's that chicken and egg problem again. Need data for money. Need money for data.
Exactly. It's very hard to break that cycle without significant targeted investment in just generating that foundational geological knowledge base. We see some regional efforts, like in Somaliland and in Puntland, trying to manage their own data better, but nationally, it's a big gap, and it contrasts sharply with the petroleum sector, where recent seismic surveys have generated more modern data attracting that specific interest.
What about basic infrastructure? Roads, ports, power?
It's a huge constraint. Infrastructure across Somalia is severely deteriorated after decades of conflict and neglect. The analysis mentions maybe only 13% of roads are paved, and even those are often in bad shape. Ports lack the capacity, the storage, the specialized equipment needed to handle bulk mineral exports efficiently. Power supply is unreliable and expensive, especially outside major towns, right, where many mineral deposits are located.
So moving anything bulky or energy intensive is a nightmare.
Pretty much, it makes transporting equipment in and minerals out incredibly difficult and costly. It adds massive expense and logistical hurdles to any potential mining project. Any large-scale development would require parallel substantial investment in upgrading this basic infrastructure.
And the legal and regulatory side, you highlighted the split between oil and other minerals.
Yes, that difference is really stark and acts as a key constraint for diversifying the potential beyond just oil and gas. The non-petroleum sector, so basically all solid minerals, is still governed by a mining law and regulations dating back to 1984.
1984. That seems ancient in terms of modern mining standards.
It is. It's completely insufficient for addressing complex modern issues like environmental impact assessments, social safeguards, community benefit sharing, mine closure planning, or attracting sophisticated international investment with clear, stable terms. While we heard about Almond Energy potentially drafting new uranium regulations, which raises its own transparency concerns, there seems to be no clear comprehensive plan underway to overhaul the general mining law for all other solid minerals.
Whereas the petroleum sector got that modern update in 2020.
Exactly. The 2020 Petroleum Law, the SPA regulator, the revenue sharing agreement, that sector has a much more contemporary legal foundation, even with the controversies around recent deals. And this big discrepancy hinders development in the potentially vast non-petroleum sector. And the lack of effective enforcement of even the old 1984 law allows illegal and unregulated artisanal mining to flourish, often with dire social environmental consequences and no benefit to the state.
How does the overall investment climate plus geopolitical interests and international partnerships fit in?
Well, the general investment climate remains very challenging due to all the risks we've discussed. It's rated as extremely high risk. However, despite that, there is growing international interest, but it tends to be quite specific, focused on particular sectors like oil and gas, or particular regions like the critical minerals push in Somaliland. We're definitely seeing increasing geopolitical competition playing out. Countries like Turkey, China, Gulf states are all vying for resources and influence. Turkey's deep involvement in the oil sector is clearly part of a broader geopolitical strategy in the Horn of Africa. International institutions like the World Bank or IMF are trying to support reforms and capacity building, which is crucial, but they face the same underlying challenges.
And the final piece, people, human capital, technical skills, a critical shortfall.
The analysis points to a significant lack of skilled Somalis in key technical and managerial fields: geology, mining, engineering, resource economics, environmental science, contract negotiation, regulatory oversight. This severely limits the country's ability to manage its own resources effectively, to negotiate good deals, and to ensure proper oversight of operations.
So a lot relies on foreign expertise.
Too much. Currently, significant investment in education and vocational training is essential. The analysis mentions some positive steps like programs at Amud University in Somaliland or efforts by the Somaliland Ministry. But building this local human capital base is fundamental if Somalis are to truly benefit from these resources in the long run, beyond just basic labor jobs, and for the nation to have effective sovereign control.
You've mentioned the regional dimensions several times, especially Somaliland and Puntland. How does their role complicate or maybe clarify the picture?
It's absolutely central to understanding how things work or don't work on the ground. Somalia operates as a federal system, and its member states, particularly Somaliland, which declared independence but isn't internationally recognized, and Puntland has exercised significant autonomy, especially regarding resources within their claimed territories. They are key players.
So they have their own ministries handling minerals?
Exactly. Somaliland has its Ministry of Energy and Minerals. They set policy, issue licenses, conduct surveys, manage their own geological database, and actively promote investment within Somaliland. Because it's been relatively more stable than southern Somalia for decades, it has, as we noted, more historical research and has recently attracted more diverse exploration interests. Oil, gas, gemstones, tin, iron, gypsum, gold. And now, very actively, those critical minerals like lithium and REs, deals with companies like Janelle, Kilomass, and the Taiwanese interest really highlight this. Puntland also has its own ministry dealing with energy and minerals. They're responsible for policy and concessions there. Gold seems to be the main focus of interest, particularly the artisanal mining in the Golis Mountains and near Milho. So both alluvial and hard rock potential. They've had past international involvement, like with range resources. However, security remains a major challenge in parts of Puntland like the Bari region, where ISIS militants are reportedly involved in illegal gold mining. The analysis suggests there's currently less documented large-scale commercial activity there compared to Somaliland.
So this regional autonomy creates a really fragmented picture for anyone trying to understand Somalia's overall mineral potential or invest it?
Absolutely does. The regions often manage their resources quite independently, while the federal government in Mogadishu claims ultimate authority over national resources. Its ability to enforce that, especially for solid minerals on the ground in Somaliland or Puntland, is often limited or contested. This creates potential for overlapping claims, disputes over ownership, and disagreements on revenue sharing. While that petroleum revenue sharing agreement exists between the FGS and the member states, extending a similar clear functional framework to cover all solid minerals across all regions seems much more complex and politically fraught. And crucially, regional stability, or lack thereof, is a massive factor influencing where investment goes and what types of projects are even feasible. For many non-petroleum investors, the predictability and stability of the regional government is often the most important factor.
Okay, we've covered a huge amount of ground. We've seen the immense potential, the history, the specific resources, the monumental challenges, the regional complexities. How does the analysis bring this all together? What's the recommended path forward to try and unlock this potential responsibly?
Well, it starts by re-tapping that treasure chest. The hydrocarbons with their massive potential, but also controversy. The uranium with its large historical estimates, but huge risks. The gold being actively exploited artisanally and linked to conflict. The world-class Sepiolite just sitting there. The various metals like tin, iron, tantalum, niobium, mostly untapped. The emerging critical minerals like lithium and REES attracting new interest, especially in Somaliland. The gemstones needing formalization, and all those industrial minerals with domestic potential. It's a really diverse portfolio. Then it starkly balances this against those deep obstacles we spent time on. The overwhelming insecurity and political instability, the crumbling infrastructure, the outdated or non-existent legal frameworks for solid minerals, the critical lack of reliable data, the pervasive governance issues and corruption, the shortage of skilled human capital, the unresolved federal-regional tensions over resource control and underlying environmental considerations. Oh, it really is a balancing act on a knife edge.
And the core message is about avoiding that resource curse, right? Making sure this doesn't just fuel more problems.
Absolutely critical. The analysis strongly emphasizes the need for a very careful, long-term, strategically sequenced approach. It warns against rushing into deals or development without the proper foundations in place, explicitly pointing to things like the TPAO deal controversy and the ongoing illegal mining by armed groups as cautionary examples of the risks involved.
So what are the key recommendations? What needs to happen first?
The analysis lays out several crucial actions, but one stands above all. Priority number 1, security and political stabilization. Nothing else is truly sustainable without addressing this. It's the absolute foundation. Beyond that, key steps: investing heavily in foundational geological data, modern mapping, comprehensive surveys, especially for non-petroleum minerals, to attract legitimate investment and informed planning, undertaking comprehensive legal and regulatory reform for the entire non-petroleum sector, Modernize that 1984 law needs transparency, strong environmental and social safeguards, clear financial terms, benefit sharing mechanisms, strengthening institutional capacity. Build up the government's ability at both federal and regional levels to actually oversee the sector. Negotiate fair deals, monomer compliance, manage revenues, fostering transparency and accountability. Things like potentially joining the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI, making contracts public, setting up transparent revenue management systems, developing critical infrastructure, strategic investments in transportation, ports, energy, clarifying federal regional resource governance, hammering out clear mutually agreed frameworks for ownership, management, and crucially revenue sharing for all types of minerals, investing significantly in human capital development, training Somalis for jobs across the entire value chain from geology to regulation, promoting value addition where feasible to capture more value domestically rather than just exporting raw materials, and finally adopting a phased and selective development approach. Maybe focus first on formalizing the existing ASM sector, developing industrial minerals for domestic needs. Large-scale projects should probably wait until governance, security, and regulatory frameworks are much stronger.
Wow, that's a monumental list. It really underscores that just having the minerals underground is only a tiny part of the equation.
It really is. The analysis makes it crystal clear. Transforming that geological potential into actual sustainable prosperity for the Somali people depends almost entirely on successfully tackling these enormous interconnected challenges related to security, governance, capacity, and infrastructure. It requires long-term, strategic, transparent vision.
So you can really see the complex picture painted by this deep dive, this immense potential, but it's locked away by equally immense challenges. It's a story where incredible geological richness meets head-on with decades of human conflict and, well, institutional weakness.
Yeah, and understanding this whole situation isn't just about knowing where the lithium or the oil might be. It's really about grasping this incredibly complex interplay of geology, yes, but also history, politics, security, global economic interests. All of that shapes the destiny of a nation like Somalia. It just shows how absolutely fundamental things like security, effective governance, and clear, fair rules are not just, to attract foreign investment, but to ensure that any wealth generated actually translates into real benefits for ordinary people instead of just becoming another source of conflict or enriching a select few.
This whole deep dive into Somalia's minerals really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? In a world that's increasingly desperate for resources, especially these critical minerals needed for our energy transition, how can a country like Somalia realistically break that cycle of instability? How can it ensure its buried treasures become a foundation for peace and shared prosperity rather than just another commodity fueling conflict if you were charting the course? What specific steps, realistically, would you prioritize first?